Good evening. Call to order the meeting of the Rockport Select Board, January 25th, 2021. We're still operating by Zoom under the pandemic rules. And we will proceed first with the town manager's report.
So I did obviously submit my written report to the select board, which was included in the materials. So I'll just touch on some highlights and add a couple of other items. Bangor Savings Bank submitted a donation to the Library Foundation for $15,000 last week, which gets them to their goal, the Library Foundation's goal. So that's a good thing. Hi, Anastasia. Yeah, we've started the meeting. We can hear you. Can you hear us okay? As most of you are aware, the budget season has started. It has started actually back in November, December. Starts with the capital improvement planning process where department heads will identify new projects and then rank projects that they have identified previously. It was a little bit later start this year than normal. Megan and I created a new form for the capital improvement requests the department heads utilize this year. I think there'll be a big improvement on them as the years go by, as we get more and more information on those forms for each project. The Capital Improvement Committee met back on January 19th and reviewed and rated each of the identified projects for consideration for the next operating budget for FY22. I've been meeting with department heads over the last week or so in reviewing their department requests and discussing them with them. Those will continue through this week pretty much. We expect to begin printing and finalizing the budget the week of February 8th and then distributing that to the budget committee members and select board Friday the 12th of February. And we do have the first budget review meeting scheduled for February 17th at 5:30. And that'll be by Zoom. All the meetings will be by Zoom and until further notice, of course. I'm happy to say that the Route 1 wastewater line extension project has been put out to bid. Bids are due back on February 4th. We have all of the required permits in place from the various agencies. As you may recall, Maine Water has chosen to work with the town on the project and also will be upgrading the water line as part of the project. So it was bid jointly with the water and sewer lines in the project. And obviously Maine Water will be paying for their share of the project. Once those bids are back in, they'll be detailed when they're submitted, which portion is responsible for the Maine Water and what portion is responsibility of the town. It'll be interesting to see what the bids prices come in at. Couple of other things that I wanted to mention. A training opportunity has come up for the clerk's staff in the town office. I was just notified today about this and I approved the office being closed on the 27th this week, as well as February 4th from 9 a.m. to noon. Normally these classes are divided up into two different days so that staff can split the classes. These are remote classes and they're only being offered on those 2 days. It's a two-part class. So I've authorized that we close the town office on the 27th and on the 4th from 9 a.m. to noon time so that the staff can receive the training. And that'll be, if it isn't already, that'll be posted on the website and on the Facebook page as well. And as you know, we've been operating in the town office throughout town with split shifts. We originally started that for 3 weeks and I continued it through the end of January. I expect to continue that for at least another 2 weeks through February 12th, trying to do it in 2-week intervals here so that we can hopefully see improvement in the pandemic numbers. But they continue to increase in Knox County and in the state. So what we're doing is working. We still don't have any cases that have affected the town office staff or the public works department. which I think is a credit to our employees, but also the safety measures and the pandemic policy that we put in place. So we'll be continuing that through February 12th at this point. Any questions?
I just wanted to highlight what you said, Bill, about the budget meetings being via Zoom, because I had gotten questions about that, because on the schedule you sent out, it said it was in the Opera House. And so people, even though live streamed, it was in the Opera House. So people were questioning that.
Yeah, we'll make sure that we send out a message to all the budget committee members, and we'll put it up on the website and change that information so that we'll see that it is obviously by Zoom and it will be live streamed.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, if you want to finish the budget one, I've got one for.
Yeah, just so we can control the meeting a little bit better, let's make sure that we do their hand raising thing, okay? So I can call on people. Yeah, Mark, go ahead. I think we're done with budget.
I had a question, Bill, on the wastewater Route 1 extension. I think Maine Water is benefiting quite handsomely, if you will, from us doing the project. Will that be reflected in what we pay and perhaps pay less because of that?
All of that is weighed in with the bid documents, yes.
Okay.
Because that was agreed to way back when we had announced the project. Maine Water had contacted our engineers with Woodard and Kern, and generally, we're sharing costs, if you will, when it comes to excavation and pavement replacement and all of that type of thing.
Well, I just was going by what you had written, and it just responsible for payment of their portion of the project. So
yeah, well, that includes it. That includes everything.
We got a hook in there somewhere.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Bill, did you want to mention something briefly about the library part that's in your town manager's report, or did I just miss that?
The donation?
Yeah, and just the overall fact of the library's total donations.
Yeah, the amount, the $15,000 brought up the Library Foundation's donations over the $2.25 million that they had promised to the town. Originally, I think it was $2 million, and then they increased it. Yep, and then they increased it with the FF&E as well, so to another $250,000. So they've exceeded that goal, which is obviously excellent for the town, excellent for the library, and certainly we appreciate all of the work and all of the individual donors as well as the business donors that participated in that project.
Thank you. That was just my point to make sure that everybody knows who's watching this live stream now or later about the incredible donation results that the foundation has received, and it's been an awesome effort on their part, a really time-consuming effort, a hard effort, but they just have incredible results that we should all be very appreciative to every one of those members for that work. Okay, anything else? All right, then the next item is do we have any comments from members of the public on matters that are not on the agenda tonight, Bill?
I do not.
All right. Going on from there, do we have any suggested amendments to the agenda?
Yes, I have one, and I'm not sure if it's done through an amendment to the agenda, but I wanted to, from the consent agenda, I'd like to take Victoria Condon off of the consent agenda and perhaps talk about that separately.
Maybe, do you want to discuss the comprehensive plan group more generally under, for example, the liaison report?
Yeah, we can talk about it at the time of liaison reports.
Mark?
Why don't we just make a motion and second it, and then we can make a check that changes based on what we hear.
Okay.
Denise?
So I move that we revise the consent agenda to reflect only Taylor Allen and Clifton Ames, and remove Victoria Condon from the consent agenda.
Okay, just for our information,
Yeah, I can provide some background if
we need
that's
a
helpful.
motion and a second for the consent agenda, do we, Bill?
Sorry, what was?
Do we need a motion and second to remove something from the consent agenda? I don't think we do we?
Well,
think-
you're,
Asked that before.
it's always better to have a motion.
Okay, I thought that I'd gotten an inconsistent response on that before, but whatever. I'll certainly second the motion just so we can have a discussion.
Yeah, and my only reason for raising it is when I read the Victoria's explanation for why she wants to resign, it's because a meeting time was picked that she can't meet. And I would just like to find out more about that and see if there's a way to find something. You know, when you look at our citizen members on the Comprehensive Plan Committee, you know, I think the select board carefully, you know, looked at trying to find a balance on the committee and balance of inputs, experience in the town, expertise. And, you know, it was sort of striking to see that we had 3 people resigning here. And Victoria is someone, I guess I'd just like to see if we can talk more about that, since it was solely based on meeting time. It wasn't her. Otherwise, it didn't seem to be her personal indication, but I haven't spoken to her, and I don't want to embarrass her or
Okay.
make this any bigger deal than it needs to be.
Thanks, Denise. I don't think we have to do this through motion in a second, but we have. So I think that Denise has clearly set forth why she would like to remove it from the consent agenda and have a discussion about it. So with a motion and a second, Michelle, your vote?
Yes.
Okay, Denise,
Yes.
Jeff,
Yes.
Mark,
No.
and I vote yes. We will remove it from the consent agenda. Okay, now we are moving on to the consent agenda, which consists of the resignations of Taylor Allen and Clifton Ames. Can I have a motion on that?
Move the board accept the consent agenda as modified.
I'll second that.
Okay, so on the votes, Jeff,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes.
Michelle,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
and I vote yes. All right, so we are tabling the Victoria Condon resignation until a discussion on the liaison reports. Okay, moving on to action items. Acting on committee applications. Greg Demarecki. I hope I can do
Very good.
Thank you for your willingness to be on the budget committee as a write-in. We really appreciate your willingness, and you certainly have a great background. So would you like to say a few words to the select board about your interest?
Sure. So I spoke with Denise and Linda, and it sounds like there was a need, and I'm happy to help. I think my background in public accounting lends some experience, and I'm just happy to volunteer my services to the town.
Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions? Is it Greg or Gregory?
It's Greg, unless my mom's mad at me.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Okay, motion?
I move the board appoint Gregory J. Domarecki to the Budget Committee with a term ending June 30, 2023.
I'll second that.
Okay, any further discussion? All right, Michelle,
Yes.
Jeff,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Okay, thanks again, Greg.
Thanks, everyone.
Greg.
Take care.
Okay, the next item is Anastasia Fisher. Hello, Anastasia, nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. So Anastasia was asked by some members of the Economic Development Committee to submit an application for that committee in which she is interested. And Anastasia, would you like to say a few words about your interest?
Sure, yeah. A couple people reached out to me to join that committee. I've owned my own business here in Rockport since I've lived here, really since I've been back in Maine the last 20 years, and mostly working remotely. So I have a lot of experience with what makes it possible for people to work remotely for large companies outside of Maine. I'm also very involved in marine and blue economy development, and am also interested in potentially seeing some agricultural incentives in Rockport. So with all that, I'd like to join this Economic Development Committee.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Somebody like to make a motion?
I move the board appoint Anastasia Fisher to the Economic Development Committee with a term ending June 30, 2024.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? Okay. Move on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff,
Yes.
Michelle,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes,
and I vote yes.
thank you, Anastasia.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Anastasia.
Have a good night. Just a quick question. Will somebody from that committee be reaching out to me now?
I think Bill will.
Yeah, the staff, either myself or Megan Brackett, the finance director, will be reaching out to you.
Super. Thank you very much. Take care. Have a nice night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, and I am just going to introduce this, and then somebody else can take it from there, Denise. But the next item on the agenda is appointing me to the Economic Development Committee. As you know, there are certain committees in which we do have a select board member. Comprehensive Plan has a couple of select board members on it. I think this is an important strategic committee. And with everything I'm doing on broadband and the history I've had in RES and so forth over the last few years, I have an interest, and I think the continuity of having people on there for several years is important. So Denise, will you take it from there?
Yeah. I think I think that makes a lot of sense under these circumstances. I guess I'll start with a motion and then we can talk about if there's any discussion. I move the board appoint Deborah Hall to the Economic Development Committee with a term ending June 30, 2024.
I'll second.
Any discussion?
How many openings are there?
This will leave, assuming that the next item on the agenda is approved, which are the bylaws of the Economic Development Committee, calls for, I think, up to 7 members. So this will leave one opening, I believe.
Yes, that's all right.
So with Deborah's appointment, that would leave one opening, or that would take that opening?
No, that would leave one opening. Deborah would be the 6th member appointed.
Deborah, are you currently the liaison for that?
I am the liaison on it, yes. But I think if we want to have a different another board member liaison, that would be fine.
Well, I think that would be probably a good thing to have happen. Not that I'd want to step up and do it, but
I'd be willing to do that if somebody else didn't want to do it. Any further discussion? Michelle?
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
Mark?
no.
Denise? Yes. And Deborah, I think you'll recuse yourself? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the motion passes 3-1. Great.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the Economic Development Committee bylaws.
So these were originally approved by the Economic Development Committee based on our template of bylaws, including the language that the board has included for all of the bylaws, which is noted in your information packet. After the bylaws were approved, I was looking at them and discussing them with Deborah when we were on a different topic, and we had noticed that the original document that was approved by the EDC basically had said that there would be, I think it was 4 members, and it just didn't make sense to have only 4 members on that committee. So we debated a little bit, and we settled on the number of 7 members, which I think probably makes sense to have a good, an uneven number first of all, and then a committee of up to 7 is probably good on that, in that group. So
Actually,
I added.
I'm sorry, Bill. Actually, the committee had 4 members and 3 alternates, which makes
Right.
sense when you're talking about a quasi judicial committee, when you have to have an alternate because somebody has a conflict. But it didn't really make sense because you'd still have 7 people participating in the committee. So we went back to the committee and made these suggestions, and the committee approved those changes.
Yes, yep, that's right. And then the other change was adding language that allows for staggered terms on the initial appointments, because that wasn't originally in there. And when I was looking at the agenda for this meeting and Anastasia Fisher's appointment came up, I said, well, we don't want all of the members having terms that expire all at the same time. So, and as Deborah said, I did poll all of the EDC members, and they agreed with those changes.
Okay, I move the board approve the Economic Development Committee bylaws as presented.
I'll second.
Any discussion? Okay, move on to a vote. Jeff,
Yes.
Michelle,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes,
sorry, did you say yes?
correct.
Denise,
Yes.
and I vote yes. All right, the next item on the agenda is to act on the Public Works Mutual Aid Agreement. Bill?
Yes, so this document came to my attention last fall when I was asking other municipalities in the area about considering a mutual aid agreement for public works in light of the pandemic. And this agreement was first accepted by the participating municipalities in 2012 and was suggested and by Knox County EMA that it be readopted, reaffirmed by the boards that are party to the agreement. And it certainly is a very comprehensive agreement. When I went through it and reviewed it, it had been previously approved by the town's legal counsel back in 2012 and was reviewed again by legal counsel to make sure that there weren't any issues with it. And it had been reviewed and approved by Knox County's legal counsel prior as well.
Bill, who else is a party to this?
Basically, it's basically all of the public works. It's all the towns that have public works departments within Knox County, such as Camden, Rockland, Thomaston, Union, and Warren was the other one.
Okay.
And basically it just allows us, if we were in an emergency situation where maybe we, in this case with a pandemic, had our staff was decimated by the pandemic or whatnot, then it allows us to ask for assistance, very much like we do with police or fire from other communities, to be able to come in, and it protects the communities and us, so that if there's damage to equipment or whatnot, then each municipality is responsible for that.
Okay.
Would you like to make a motion?
I move the board approve the Public Works Mutual Aid Agreement as presented.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All right, so move on to a vote. Michelle,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Jeff,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Okay, moving on to discussion items. Bill, would you like to introduce the next item, which is the presentation on short-term rental registration ordinance, the third draft?
So, my notes, sorry. So tonight's presentation is of the third draft of the short-term rental registration ordinance. And there is a PowerPoint presentation which is included in your materials. And Deborah and Denise, if figure once I introduce this topic, I can put that up on the screen. Then you guys can work through that and just let me know when you need the next slide. The third draft was revised by Towns Outside Counsel and includes essentially 3 parts. Part 1 is the amendments to the land use ordinance, mostly definitions. Part 2 is the actual short-term rental registration ordinance language. And then part 3 is the effective date of the ordinance if it's approved by the voters. Discussion item is for the board to view and discuss the additional changes that were made to the proposed ordinance in response to the public comments that have been received throughout this process and since the last, especially since the last version of this ordinance, the second draft. Keep in mind that we do have a workshop that's scheduled that I'm going to moderate on February 16th at 5:30 via Zoom so that we can get public comments. And the reason that it's February 16th is to allow residents and other concerned individuals to review the ordinance, be able to really look at this presentation tonight, and then respond with their comments on the third draft of the ordinance.
So the way we have set this up is that there is a presentation that Denise and I will share. And I know that there's going to be lots of commentary and discussion, which I invite. And so anyone who has comments, we would ask that you let us get through the presentation and any additional explanations on the draft, and then we open it up to discussion by the board. But in order to at least lay out our presentation, if you would please reserve your comments until the discussion period.
Deborah, this is just real quick. I'll reserve time during that point for some comments if I could.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Mark. Or Jeff. All right. So I think in first thing would be to turn your attention, if you would, to the presentation, and I think that will be the best way to introduce this. So bear with me as I shuffle my paper around here. All right. As you know, this effort was resident driven in the sense that we had received numerous complaints by residents to address this project. We had this issue, I should say. We had a select board workshop in September to hear resident concerns. We reviewed, recall that we had our summer intern work during the summer to put together existing and pending SDR regulations in and outside of Maine. And other resources. And then we held meetings and workshops on July 9th and on November 9th. We had made a number of amendments in response to the resident concerns that we have received, and that's the next slide. For example, as a result of resident requests and feedback, we have made a distinction between owner-occupied and non-owner occupied. We initially had proposed a minimum stay, as Camden has, and a number of other towns that we'll get into have. We reduced that minimum stay in the last ordinance from draft ordinance from 7 to 4 nights. It was suggested that 4 to 5 nights is what the trend in short-term rental is. So we actually, in the last draft, had reduced it to that lower number of being 4 nights.
That would only apply to the non-owner occupied. There's no minimum.
Thanks, Denise. That's right. There's no minimum stay for owner occupied. We deleted requirements. Remember, there were requirements relating to fire pits and setbacks. The board had asked that the initial draft be based roughly on the formatting that was in the, was it the Falmouth?
Freeport, I think.
Freeport. And they had the requirements relating to fire pits and setbacks. So we readily took those out in response to resident feedback. We grandfathered in existing STRs in recognition of the fact that people are earning income on that, and we don't want people to have a loss of income. We exempted resort districts. This was one that was added to this draft because we received comments from, whoops, we went too far. We received comments from some of the Samoset timeshares and so forth that obviously timeshares don't fit within the idea of the short-term rental ordinance, and we can discuss that in more detail. We had received comments about concerns that people wanted to be able to pass their STR approval status onto their families through inheritance, and we did make that change, not this time, but in the last draft. Limit temporary moratorium and cap restrictions to the most densely populated areas of Rockport. We did, we've had that in there for, I think, from the beginning. In response to residents asking us to really focus on the areas that we need to, the majority of the board feels that we need to focus on.
And those are the areas where, frankly, we've heard from more residents with concerns about the impact of short-term rentals on their neighborhoods.
Yep. So I don't think those are the total list of amendments that have been made over the course of these various drafts as a result of resident feedback, but I think it captures most of them. The next slide is intended to just set what Rockport is contemplating in the context of Maine generally. You can certainly go out of Maine and you see all kinds of stuff, but like Boston and New York that don't even allow non-owner occupied STRs at all, but that gets us outside of what's really relevant, I think, to us. So this is a list of 19 towns that either have adopted or are considering short-term rental regulation, and a number of those are on the ballots in the upcoming June election, where they are pending. A number of them are already in place. Some of them already have STRs in place, and they're tightening up on the short-term regulation. So to the extent that, we received feedback that we're somehow doing something different in Rockport, I think that the sheer fact of 19 shows that, we're sort of in the mainstream of what's going on by addressing the issue. And I just in closing on this slide would say that I ran out of steam after 19. There are perhaps more towns out there, but I felt that 19 kind of showed us that that there's a good number of towns that have adopted or are considering STR ordinances. Okay, next one. So I kind of borrowed this slide from a good one that Falmouth had in a PowerPoint presentation, and they noted, and I have found the same to be true, that the commonalities across the ordinances, for the most part, that you see in Maine are the distinction between owner and non-owner occupied, as we have done, the annual registration and fee, which of course we are proposing, life safety inspections upon registration. And I think this is an important one because there are a number of towns that require a life safety inspection by the code enforcement officer or other official before you could register, even for existing STRs. And we are not proposing that in any way whatsoever. As we get to the regulation itself, we will be pointing out that we authorize inspections, but there's no intent of requiring them. Emergency contact, sometimes the ordinances go so far, emergency contact is a commonality across ordinances. Sometimes they go so far as to require a response within a certain number of hours, sometimes 60 minutes, sometimes as low as 30 minutes, which of course really becomes rather onerous. So we're not doing anything like that. We are proposing that there be an emergency contact 24/7 that is available, but we have not suggested placing any kind of limits on response time. Notifications to abutters of the emergency contact, that's something that's in our proposal and has been all along. Insurance requirements. Some towns require the production of the insurance policy so they can take a look at the insurance policy, make sure that it requires, it permits short-term rentals, et cetera, et cetera. We don't do anything like that. We just want evidence that there is an insurance policy to protect renters. Going on to the second and last page of this particular topic, minimum rental period in terms of is typically 5 to 7 days. Again, regardless of the actual number of days the unit is occupied. We again have reduced that to 4. I frankly haven't seen any ordinance. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen any ordinance that reduces it down to 4. But we did that in response to the concerns that we've heard. Dedicated off-street parking requirements are a very common provision in these ordinances. Occupancy limits, references to occupancy limits in comparison to what the sewer requirements for that particular dwelling and so forth. Registration number is required on the premises and in advertisements. And I think there was maybe some wording that was confusing to some, at least one commenter who provided a letter, I think today, that said that we were requiring signs. We're certainly not requiring signs with the registration number. The idea here is that towns require, and the draft requires, that the registration number be displayed on the rented property. Meaning, like, when you go to a hotel and you close the door and it says, here's your checkout times and stuff, somewhere just simply in the unit itself have the registration number. That is a common requirement, as is having it in advertisements, emails, etc. And there's reasons for all of that. Most of these ordinances provide for no transfer of the registration. We did that as well, except in the case of inheritance, because we've listened to our residents. Owners required to keep records of all transactions for presentation to municipalities on request. We haven't done anything to that degree either. There are a number of towns in Maine that require that kind of record keeping, and we are not proposing that. Of course, penalties, fines, suspensions of the permit for violations is pretty common in order to enforce, because you can't have an ordinance that you don't enforce. The next one, and I'm about to turn this over to you, Denise, but let's see. I had a few kind of outliers that we listed here. At least 5 municipalities require proof of residency as a registration requirement for owner-occupied units. So in the case of owner-occupied units, those 5 municipalities are saying this has to be your primary residence for purposes of taxation. It can't be it's your tax-paying residence. And that's the only situation in which you can have an owner-occupied unit. So for those who have second homes here, they could not have an owner-occupied unit. We have not done that, and we have treated, in this draft, we treat residents and non-residents the same. The second bullet, limits on numbers of STRs that can be registered by an owner. We had proposed in the last draft, and we've continued to have in this draft, a suggestion of 2. This ranges anywhere from 1 to 5. in other ordinances. Obviously, those municipalities that require the proof of residency as indicated in the first bullet only allow you to have one because it has to be, your residence, and you can only live in one spot as primary resident. There are several municipalities that place caps on the number of non-owner occupied short-term rental units registered in one calendar year. And that's Portland, Bar Harbor, Kittery, and Rockland. And that is something that is new to this particular draft, which we will no doubt be discussing and getting into. There are several towns that limit number of rental days. So even though they give a permit for either owner occupied or non-owner occupied, they still say, but you can only rent those days, X number of days out of the entire year. By contrast, in our draft, if you have a registration that permits an owner occupied or non-owner occupied STR, you can rent for as many days, 365 days if you wish. So there's nothing like that in this ordinance either. South Portland prohibits non-owner occupied in all residential zoning districts in order to avoid having what they perceive as a commercial use in those zoning districts. We have not done anything in terms of prohibiting non-owner or owner occupied in any residential zone. Okay, I think the next slide, Bill, and that gets us.
I'll start here. And this is just a brief summary of what what's in the current draft. And I think it's really important to emphasize that the owner occupied short-term rentals, those we have tried to protect those in every way possible to minimize the extent to which the regulation would impact them. And really all we require with those is that they register annually a minimal fee that would need to be paid along with the registration, and that's just to cover the staff time to review the registration. No minimum stay requirements, not subject to the temporary moratorium or aggregate caps. In every zoning district in town, you can operate an owner-occupied short-term rental as long as you meet the off-street parking requirements. So I can't emphasize that enough because it seems like when we review the public comments, many of the commenters are in this situation. This is the category that they're subject to. And these are the people that are looking for extra income, are looking for ways to enhance the value of their property by being able to either rent out rooms in their house or a room over the garage or a separate building on the property or an abutting property. And we really wanted to protect that. And that's consistent with a lot of these other towns, that the owner occupied STRs, frankly, are not the problem. It's the non-owner occupied that is really the focus of our regulation. And Bill, I'd be ready for the next slide. For non-owner occupied STRs, there's again the requirement to register and pay a minimal fee annually. These are subject to under the current draft, a 4-day minimum stay requirement, and that's been reduced, as Deborah indicated, from the original 7 days, which is a much more common minimum stay. But we did hear from the commenters that really in the world of short-term rentals, 4 days is sort of if you require much longer, it will make it more difficult for them to continue to operate these businesses that they have. Existing STRs are grandfathered in as long as they can meet the off-street parking requirements. So anybody who has already invested money in fixing up an STR, has got it on the market and has been renting it out, we're not trying to put them out of business at all. We just want to know who they are, where they are, and have some way to account for them. And that's, I think, what some of residents in our town think that that's what we ought to be doing. And I'll talk about that in a sec. The not existing grandfathered STRs would be subject to a 2-year moratorium in the 5 most densely populated zoning districts only. So if you're in in one of these, if you're not in the zoning districts that are subject to the regulation, you can still start up a new STR. You can, if you've got some acreage on the other side of Route 1 and you want to meet people from all over the world and have an STR, there's nothing in this ordinance that would prevent you from doing that if you're outside of those 5 zoning districts. The distance and overall aggregate cap, which means, you got to be, if you're a new non-owner occupied STR, if you're within 1,000, you could not start a new STR non-owner occupied within 1,000 feet of an existing non-owner occupied STR. And then the 50% cap. And again, that's in those 5 most densely populated districts only. And that really is designed to listen to who we heard from in town, in the town of Rockport, where we saw the primary concerns arising from short-term rentals. It was in these more populated districts where people valued close by neighbors, but found that they were now losing those neighbors. And all of a sudden they just had constant turnover of different people coming in and out in what they had thought of as their neighborhood. Existing and registered non-owner occupied STRs retain priority each year. So as long as you're already in the system as either an existing non-owner occupied, or maybe now you're in the new category, new, you went through the registration for the first time, you got zoning approval to operate an STR. Once that happens, then you're in the system, you get a priority. And you can be assured, as long as you meet your registration deadlines, of being able to continue to operate your business in those areas. And then new non-owner occupied STRs are permitted in all other zoning districts without limitation, as long as the parking requirements are met. So it's an attempt, we were faced, and I think Deborah indicated this in the beginning, we have residents on both sides of this issue and all over and in between. We've got residents who feel like the town, they're losing the feeling of their town, that there are too many of these short-term rentals, their neighborhoods don't feel the way that they used to feel. They're worried. I've had several people come to me and talk to me about other towns that they used to love and enjoy being in that were essentially gutted out and lost their flavor once short-term rentals sort of took over. All of a sudden it was nothing but a tourist town with lots of rentals, but no people who lived there and appreciated the community that they had. And that's not to be negative about tourists. We love tourists in Rockport, but in order to have the core of a community, we have to have more than just tourists. But again, you've got people who feel that way, and then you have other people who feel like we should not touch private property. Whatever you want to do with your property, the town of Rockport should not tell you what you can do with your property. And we listen to that and we hear that. And that, I think, is our attempt here to say, we as the select board represent everyone in the town of Rockport. And we have people who want short-term rental regulation and some who don't even want it to be allowed. We have others who don't want any sort of regulation. And I think as a select board, what we've tried to do here is come up with a minimal short-term rental regulation that takes into account what other towns who are similarly situated in Maine are doing. We've listened to the various town residents who've had comments on our drafts. We've tried to come up with a very sort of surgical regulation that addresses the specific concerns we've heard from our residents. And then we leave it up to the residents to vote. How can we as a select board say we're not going to even adopt or even propose short-term rental regulations because we're hearing from people that they don't want it, when we're hearing also from other people that they really think that's our job? And I guess I fall into that. Well, I'm advocating, but anyway, I think it's important for people to realize that we've tried to balance these different interests in the town, because we have all been getting, some very strongly worded letters, and we know the passion is out there and people feel very strongly on both sides of this issue. But this draft is an attempt to just be as narrow as possible to address the concerns we've heard from some of our residents.
Denise, I think you got one more slide.
Oh, darn. Okay. All right. So additional requirements. STRs are subject to basic health and safety requirements. So that means that is the next bullet point indicates that inspections would be authorized if the town of Rockport received complaints or wanted to go check something out. They would have the authority to do that. But all we're asking for is that the owners fill out a self-compliance affidavit. The owners designate a responsible agent and provide the contact info to the town and abutting neighbors. And that's to address the issue where, there's loud music next door and it's 10 at night. It gives the neighbor a contact person or gives the town some point of contact, again, for non-owner occupied who are not on premises. Off-street parking must be provided for all short-term rentals. Registration numbers are required on the premises and in any advertisements. And that's, again, to confirm that folks are in compliance with the registration regulation.
And again, that's not to say that that's not a sign, as somebody misinterpreted recently. That's not us saying that that there should be a sign with your registration number in some tacky manner in your yard. In fact, the signs, I think we discussed at a recent select board meeting and asked the ORC to put as a priority redoing the sign ordinance, because there's some I think it's based on recent case law, that there's some very specific things about what can and can't be done with respect to signs and free speech and all that good stuff. So all that necessary stuff. That was misinterpreted. The registration number is simply something that has to be, on the premises, inside the premises. And if somebody chooses to have a sign, which it was suggested no one does that, but there are at least 2 STRs that do have signs in their yards right now. If they have signs, then they would be, just regulated like any other sign pursuant to Rockport's sign ordinance.
Yep. And then the penalties and fines would apply to violations, and those fines and penalties could include revocation or suspension of the STR permit. Is that it?
Yeah, we're almost done, you guys, until we get to the discussion now. If we can just take a look at the ordinance. We're not going to take you through the entire thing. There are just a couple things that Phil, in his review, for example, had made some changes to, and we just wanted to point those out for you. He's for those, let's see, we can get into questions that you have, but let me just say, I was going to point out a few more things, and I think something that we might want to talk about at some point is this idea that on the complying with zoning and habitability and life safety requirements, that's on page 3 at the top under C. That's been there all along, but it occurred to me, and I don't think I heard comments on this, but we might need to think about, making that a little clearer for people, because, it's hard to navigate. What does that mean? What that means is basic things like smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors and having, ingress and egress. It doesn't mean putting sprinklers in your place. I think that there are some places in Rockland that required and non-owner occupied, maybe multiple unit, but if you're in a place that doesn't require a sprinkler, this does not require to put a sprinkler in. So we might need to make that a little clearer for people. In that display of registration number on the same page on 3.3, we might need to say that, hey, this is an inside placement of your registration number, not a sign on the outside, and then let's see, and then I think what I really wanted to point your attention to, I'm going through here, is the effective dates, which Phil added on page 6. So starting, actually, I think the effective dates, the discussion starts on 6, it goes into 7. But the way this works, as he has drafted it, is that the ordinance, if it were adopted, becomes effective when other ordinances by default become effective, and that's in 7 days after the town meeting. And so the ordinance is in effect, but then non-owner, owner occupied doesn't have to be grandfathered in. It doesn't have anything that it has to do, right? So we're not even talking about owner occupied. Although they are required to annually register, what I'm focusing on now is the non-owner occupied. In order to be grandfathered in, then the non-owner occupied owners would need to file their application by September 1st. It doesn't mean that Scott Bickford acts on them by September 1st, just that they have to file by September 1st. And then the idea is that all through the summer, you continue to, the summer of this year, you continue to operate as if you have a permit. So it doesn't upset the apple cart with respect to 2021 STRs. And then once you're grandfathered in, it doesn't upset the apple cart with respect to future years of STRs if you're grandfathered in. Or if you're owner occupied, you don't even have to be grandfathered in, you just operate. And then that's with respect to existing. And then it does, we have had in this draft for this draft and its predecessors, a 2-year moratorium for us to sort of get our arms around what we have. And I think there ought to be a discussion by the board as to whether or not that's even necessary or whatever. But I do think that that's something that that could be a good area to focus on for potential amendment. Then on page 7, you might recall in the prior draft, we had some pretty subjective criteria in there for those. Remember that Denise said future, and this is just future non-owner occupied STRs. After that 2-year moratorium, that they would have to apply to the planning board, or appeal to the planning board. The planning board would look at, they would take commentary and so forth from neighbors as to whether or not this was going to be an okay use. Actually, from Phil's perspective, that was a little too subjective. So what he had suggested actually was the potential of putting in the 1,000 feet requirement, and also a percentage, which a lot of other towns have done, that have put aggregate caps on a percentage of increase. So for example, if on September 1st, those non-owner occupied STRs that are grandfathered in, if let's say there's 100 of them in Rockport, okay, then that would be the baseline. And that means that we can never go above 150. And at that point, somebody has to fall off for somebody to be put on. Maybe there's a waiting list. I don't know. But that's the idea. So that the 1,000 feet requirement only applies to new non-owner occupied STRs. It was aimed at trying to avoid an overconcentration of STRs in one particular neighborhood. It only applies to those 5 most densely populated areas in Rockport, not to the rest of Rockport. And it does not apply to the grandfathered STRs. If you've got 3 STRs in a row right next to each other, they get grandfathered in right next to each other. So if you've got a situation that some people have complained about, that they already have half of their street is STRs, that doesn't change under this ordinance. But you don't have a situation where you get 3 or 4 more on the same street. And then the other, the 50%, again, only applies to those 5 most densely populated zones. It doesn't apply to the existing STRs, because it's the existing STRs to sort of set the baseline for what 50% more looks like. I hope that's clear. Okay, Denise, did we forget anything?
I
before we,
think we should listen.
okay, we're ready. Go for it, you guys. Time for discussion. Please raise your hands though, so that we can, yes, thanks, Jeff.
A short one, and then perhaps maybe later a little bit longer one. A question on registration of short-term rental property. I believe in an earlier draft, we had required during the registration process that the applicant provide proof that they are not encumbered by neighborhood covenants to one way or another regarding business activity in those neighborhoods, but I don't see that in this draft. Am I missing it?
No, you're not. It fell off because Phil, it was Phil's opinion that we couldn't have it in there because the board cannot get involved in those individual covenants of, between property owners.
Okay. And then the second one, just, I think we might want to back up a step when we say all people currently doing it will be grandfathered. But I would assume that because of issues associated with either the building not being designed for inhabited people, nor some very basic safety items not being able to be even provided, that a permit would not be issued.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You're right. And we try to say that whenever we talk about it. Sometimes we forget to say it every single time, but you still have to meet the parking requirements in order to be, to get a registration. Even if you have an existing one, you still have to meet the parking requirements. And plus you are, even if you have an existing one, in order to be registered, you don't have to get a pre-registration inspection like a number of towns require in Maine, but you are subject to inspection. So if, the code officer looks at a place and says, I can tell that I don't think that house has, proper ingress or egress, he has the authority to go in and find out if that's the case. So yes, Jeff, you're right.
I'll save some more comments for later.
So,
Yeah, I have several comments I want to make, and coming on in August, certainly the newest one to this discussion, but I'll ask the same question that I started, I guess, in November. And I think the thing that still concerns me is we don't have data to support. We don't have information to support that we need an ordinance. And I think we say we're listening, but overwhelmingly that's what people are telling us is what's happening. Why do we need this? So I think that first and foremost is what I'm continuing to ask myself, and people are continuing to ask me, is why are we pushing for this? Why, when there's no data to support that there is, quote, a problem, what are we trying to fix? And if someone had a bad experience and one time, it doesn't mean that everybody's having a bad experience. So I just want to put that on the table first. A couple of things that I am concerned about as I look through this is, we're talking about registration, we're talking about the potential of inspection, we're talking about enforcement. Do we have the resources to do that? What is the cost? I mean, Scott Bickford has a full-time job today, so would we expect that he would have the ability to get through this, do inspections that are needed, etc.? So I want us to, consider and ponder that. The other thing that is, I guess, concerning, or I continue to question as I look through this, is we're classifying short-term rentals as commercial. We don't classify long-term rentals. And so are there going to be other impacts to people, such as the need to pay any personal property tax or anything else, anything that someone would have to pay because they're now considered commercial? I understand parking challenges, but again, do we require parking for a long-term rental? I'm not sure we do. And we don't require inspection. So I think that, there are a lot of questions about that. If we are going to require these, and I'm not advocating that we require them for long-term, but why is it different? As a short-term owner, our short-term rental owners are in there consistently. They're likely to see a safety violation probably faster or sooner than someone who has a long-term renter in there. So I think, when I listen to people, and I know we've all gotten a lot of emails, I know we've gotten probably phone calls. I think that's the biggest question is why are we trying to push so hard on something where we really can't go back to people and say we have data to support it, that there's a problem that we really are trying to fix. I'm absolutely a proponent of being proactive, but I think really we need to maybe put the brakes on a little, ask people the questions. I mean, we're in a pandemic. We haven't really been able to listen to people. I know there were other workshops where people got together, but we haven't been able to get people in a room and really discuss this. And I know that there's a lot of passion in what's being sent on email and letters. And I think the perception is that we're getting these and we're posting them to the website, but we really aren't listening. And I think that that's a concern. And I think, Denise, you said it is our job to listen, and it's our job to make sure we're balancing. And I get that. But I'm also concerned that we're trying to get something on a June ballot that is causing angst amongst our residents. It's pitting neighbor against neighbor. And really, I think there are some fundamental questions that we need to answer. I mean, I don't think we even know to this day, and that's probably one of the challenges, is how many SDRs do we even have in Rockport? So I think that there are some questions. I know there's been a lot of work put into this, but I think there are other questions that need to be answered before we start, before we continue to try to get this on a June ballot.
Thanks, Michelle. And we're going to get to you, Mark. I just want to make sure that we respond to Michelle's questions. Somebody, not me, responds to Michelle's questions and deals with those, and then we'll move right on to you, Mark. Okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, I do think that there are parking requirements for single-family dwellings, Section 803 of the Land Use Ordinance. So parking, we're not creating some new requirement by this parking obligation. That's just all units are subject to parking requirements. And then Section 604 of the Land Use Ordinance provides for inspection of rental dwelling units. And so that's both short-term, I mean, it's long-term rentals really is what's intended, I guess, here, but that is why we've made a reference to 604.2 in terms of the habitability standard. So again, we're not creating new requirements for just short-term rentals. This is something already in our land use ordinance.
Bill, I would ask you to respond to Michelle's question about the enforcement and inspections.
Yeah, so I've had discussions. One of the things that we've been looking at in the code office is how to handle any new proposed ordinance on short-term rentals if it is approved, if it goes to the ballot and is approved. And so we've been looking at some different software programs for the registration that would ease that burden on the code enforcement office, so that several of these programs, basically the owners of short-term rentals would simply go on the website and complete the information on the website in a form that we'll be able to create basically ourselves. I mean, they're canned programs, but they're designed specifically for this type of regulation around the country. So there would be not as much burden on the code office to handle these registrations as you would first think when you look at the ordinance because of the software. I will add too that the softwares that we've been looking at, one that we probably would recommend actually would help us in another part of the office as well. It's still within the code office, but on another task, because there are currently some things that we're doing that we could do more efficiently. And this software actually would help us be more efficient in other aspects of the code office work too. So it's not just, wouldn't help just this one area. But
And Bill, doesn't I think that you're looking at the software also being a way where in order to make it streamlined as possible for people to be able to register their STR online to the extent possible. Is that right?
yes, absolutely.
So again, another efficiency that we're trying to make this as easy as we can and least onerous to have to register. We register cars, we register all kinds of things, and hopefully this wouldn't be much more onerous than that, especially for the owner-occupied ones and the grandfathered in ones. On inspections, I guess you can comment on that, Bill, but clearly we had these discussions, early on. We met with the code enforcement officer, in drafting the initial discussion draft. And clearly there is not sufficient staff to go around and inspect all the STRs. And so that was never the intent. It's never been in the draft that thou shalt inspect STRs. And it's certainly not Rockport's intent, because Rockport just doesn't have the staff to do it. What it does is it authorizes the town, if there's a complaint, if there's a problem, if there's something that says, oh, wait a minute, there could be a problem here, it authorizes the code officer to go in and check it out. And I can't imagine why we would think that's not a good thing. And as Denise points out, it's true for long-term rentals. Why would it be exempt for short-term rentals? And then I think that took care of the no data thing. I don't know what the data is going to tell us, Michelle. We know that we have like lots of STRs. We have some of these vendors who have come to the town and said, oh, this is how many we found in there. I mean, I know various members of the board have combed through Airbnb and VRBO. We know we have a lot of STRs out there. We know we have a lot of anecdotal data, but we do need the data. But I don't think we need the data to know that part of the town thinks there are problems, and use, what I don't think we need to do is to use that for a reason not to act. Did anybody else have any response to Michelle's questions or comments? Jeff?
Well, just on the numbers, the last check I did on online, and again, the accuracy is probably highly variable, but it was between 79 and 265 short-term rentals. There are literally dozens of websites to get a short-term rental through in the town of Rockport. The big ones we know about.
I'll be honest with you, absolutely honest with you. I don't know about how the business personal property tax applies to short-term rentals. And that's an absolutely fair question. And I know that it's been suggested that it would be very hard to figure out how to apply business personal property tax to short-term rentals. On the other hand, we know that hotels and other businesses pay business personal property tax. And to the extent that some of these are run like businesses, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. It's certainly something that this board should discuss and think about. This is not a final draft here yet, but it's a good one. Did anybody have any comments back to Michelle? I think we hit on all your points.
I think we got them. The no data, I guess, could also be interpreted as if we don't have any information that short-term rentals are causing problems. If the data is to show that there's an issue with short-term rentals in town, I think my response to that is just that I've heard from residents who have expressed concerns with short-term rentals. So for me, that's the data that justifies beginning this process. But ultimately, it will be the voters in the town of Rockport who will decide.
And I've heard that too. And I have empathy with it because I've experienced my own, as I've said, my own problems with short-term rentals. To suggest that there aren't any problems is just not fact. It's not factual. And we have answered the question time and time again. The police department does not classify calls to the police department on the basis of short-term rentals. And as one commentator pointed out, one resident pointed out, just because you don't call the police doesn't mean there's not a problem. So anyway, thank you for adding that, Denise. Okay, Mark, we're handing it over to you.
Well, I hadn't even begun to think about the personal property tax, not that that's coming up later in our agenda. I'm not going to ask about liking to have. I want an answer from Carrie and Bill for the 16th meeting as to what those costs would be, because people that are going to be voting on this need to know what that is or what the anticipation of that is. So I want an answer for the personal property tax question for the 16th meeting. the workshop. I want also, not I like, I want the costs associated with any software or man hours, because, you know, we're assuming, I mean, you know, all these people now that have talked to Denise and everybody else around that have complaints, those are the people that are going to be calling up and calling for Scott to go check on these places. So it's not like it's not going to happen. So we have to be realistic and factor in some form of cost associated with Scott to do this. 3 hours a week, I don't know, pick a number, but it would be unrealistic if everybody is still so unhappy that they report their neighbors anonymously, that they wouldn't report it again to a board member, who in turn would go to Bill, who in turn would go to Scott. So there needs to be a number put on his, I don't know how you're going to do it, but there's got to be something put on there, because it's going to happen. These complaints that are being perceived aren't going to just go away because we have an ordinance. You know, and my only comment that I had, and, you know, is there a downside? Is there a downside for us waiting until perhaps early summer, when we can have public meetings, perhaps, and it gets a chance to be vetted out a little more thoroughly with some of the things that even I brought up tonight? You know, the public can go to the meetings. We can talk like we should be talking. I mean, we as a board have experienced technical difficulties with Zoom, you know, so it is difficult to hold meetings. So I'm just asking if there is a downside. And when I mean a downside, I mean it just waiting until November for it to go on and have an opportunity to be more thoroughly thought of. I mean, because we're coming up with things today, you know, that weren't thought of before.
I don't think we're coming up with things today that aren't thought of. I mean, these are things that are thought of. We just may not have the answer to them, like on the business personal property tax.
Well, there you go. Have been thought of.
Hey, we've got months left before the election, Mark. You know, so that's.
Is there a downside?
Yeah, I would say the downside. I'll point out the downside. The downside is that we have been considering this for 1.5 years. We had intended to have it on the ballot in November, and it was just feeling too rushed, so we put it off until June. We are not doing anything that's going to affect anybody's current, unless they don't meet parking requirements or some life safety issue, which should be a problem anyway. We are not affecting, during a pandemic, anybody's ability to earn income. And so that's not a downside. And that's an argument, though, raised to us, I think, doesn't have any real merit. And I do know, and I'm going to just be honest about this, that I have seen some of the distribution that I think you're on, Mark, and maybe Michelle is on, where some residents have suggested, let's just delay this. Let's ask for in-person meetings, even though you've had all the opportunity to have comments during Zoom meetings. Let's delay as much as we can, so that hopefully come June, we have a different select board and this issue will go away.
Madam Chair,
I think that's
as Denise pointed out to you, I'm representing some of the other people that you guys don't listen to. Okay, that's my opinion, as Denise voiced hers.
That's
so
fine, Mark. That's fine.
Let's move on.
No, Mark, let me answer. I get to talk now. You raised a question about downside, and I am responding to that. And my response is, and I am not criticizing you or Michelle or anybody for being on that group. I'm just saying that you guys know it's true what I'm talking about. And so there are people who want to see a different select board who will not impose, putting this on the ballot. I mean, what are we afraid of? Let's put it on the ballot. This is the will of the Rockport residents that should prevail here. I'm not afraid of putting it on the ballot. If it doesn't pass, it doesn't pass. It's no skin off my nose. Let's put it on the ballot and let the residents speak. The downside is never getting it to the ballot and letting the residents of this town speak.
I
And
didn't say that it wouldn't go to a ballot. I said it would provide opportunity for people to actually be in person and talk about it, and then have it go on the ballot in November.
And what do you gain by having in-person meetings, Mark, when we've had three workshops, and one or two of them were in person? And what do we gain by having them in person when we're about to have our fourth one? Just what do we gain? Okay, any other comments? Jeff?
Important mine now. You know, the short-term rental activity is certainly a very real issue in many towns and cities in the United States, in the state of Maine and in the mid-coast. I think what we need to do is step back and say to ourselves, not in terms of time. I am a proponent of pushing this through the process, having the select board vote on whether or not to move it forward through the ordinance committee and then through public comment and for vote in June of this year. But I think that we need to look at this and say, you know, let's not determine whether there are issues or not issues at the current time. Let's look at this as an opportunity to be proactive in developing an ordinance that will help sustain the needs of all parties involved and yet maintain the community vibe of the town of Rockport. I know, and if you look back in the course of history, the reason that planning boards came to use was because of things such as urban sprawl. And the reason that land use ordinances came into play is because of just abuse of the environment and other things. So we would benefit as a town by being proactive on this. You know, we voted to draft an ordinance on the short-term rentals. We've been working on it for quite some time. We've received a lot of feedback. It was both expected and desired. The workshops, although they've been, and the meetings have been virtually and through, as a result of COVID-19, we've received more feedback on this issue than I think we might have ever received on many other issues in the past combined. And I think we've got plenty of feedback. My hope is going forward that feedback rises to a proper level of decorum in the quality and content. I am quite concerned that some of the commentary I've read of recent and even since the beginning has been what I consider unacceptable from a dialogue. It needs to improve substantially for me to take some of the commentary to heart. My other concern is that attacks on drafters, town employees, select board members, etc., is not appropriate. We want to make sure going forward that good people run for the select board. We want to make sure that people are not badgered or otherwise harangued, and so as not to dissuade people in the future from running for the select board. And I am concerned that some of that activity is occurring based on commentary I have read of recent. So again, let's be proactive. You know, short-term rentals are a business, and businesses do require, even if minimal, a level of registration. This ordinance isn't about, well, it is about balancing the needs of those who wish to extract profit from their property versus neighborhood sanctity and respect for neighbors. The overall safety and quality of life of both short-term rental guests, neighbors, and community residents and first responders. This draft ordinance does just that. It's not onerous. If you look at the registration requirements, it's not much more onerous than registering a new vehicle. In fact, it lends itself very well to online registration, and I think that process could be quite painless in the end. We'll leave it at that.
Anybody else? Okay, with that, Bill, you'll be conducting the February 16th workshop, and we'll look forward to getting further comments. We do need to get to the bottom of this business personal property tax issue. And I know that you're in the process of figuring out costs of software and all of that, and we'll continue to do that.
Yep, absolutely. I'll talk with Carrie, the assessor, about the personal property tax issue and have him do some research, perhaps with the other towns that already have regulations in place, to see what they do. And obviously with the state main revenue services. And yes, I've already looked at the software. We know what those costs are. And all we can do is figure out, based on the numbers of short-term rentals that we know about, through the various sites that we've looked at, and take a percentage of how many complaints may we get, and figure out what some sort of reasonable amount of in response time, if you will, from the code office, and put a dollar figure to that. But that's it's hard. It's going to be a guesstimate, simply because we don't respond to those complaints now. But we can.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and also some of those costs are going to be there anyway. I mean, for example, when I've had short-term rental folks that, as I've mentioned before, that have parked in my driveway, impeding any kind of access, where I could not, when I came back from dinner, get back into my driveway, and let alone an emergency vehicle getting into my driveway where my elderly parents live with me. I had to call the police. And even though, again, that's not recorded as a short-term rental complaint, it was. But my point being that I would call the police anyway. I would have called the police with or without this ordinance. So some of those costs to the town in responding to problems are going to be there anyway, with or without an ordinance. So we just need to make sure that we take that into account somehow. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody, for your good discussion, I'd say, on the topic. Okay. The next item on the agenda is delinquent personal property tax collections. And thank you, Mark, for sort of helping us force the issue to discuss this matter, which is probably long overdue. Bill?
Way to.
Yep. So I did forward you a list earlier, or this afternoon, of a current list of delinquent taxpayers for personal property tax. And I have talked with town clerk and tax collector Linda Greenlaw. One of the reasons she's involved in this meeting is because she is the tax collector, and it is her responsibility to pursue collection of these, obviously under state law and with what we can do and can't do. And she certainly can expand on some of the things she's done in the past. But my understanding is that in the past, the town has been trying to reach an agreement with delinquent personal property taxpayers, first and foremost, to try to either some sort of a payment arrangement on a monthly basis or weekly basis or something along those lines. Personal property tax is more difficult to collect than real estate tax because we don't have the ability to put a lien on that property like we can with real estate. So it is a little bit more difficult. That said, there are means for us to be able to do some things to collect, whether it's through small claims court, business. We certainly can file UCCs within the required statutory window. But at this point, we need to, my recommendation to the board tonight is for Linda and I to come up with a plan, and then have the board take a look at it and see what you think of that plan. Once we fully go through the requirements that with the state laws that we're allowed to, the options that we have according to state laws to collect delinquent personal property taxes. And Linda, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I have spoken to some of the individuals that are in debt to us for personal property in large amounts of money. they make promises that they will set up an agreement with me. And then it just never happens to come to be. So I agree with Bill. I think if he and I set together and brainstorm and talk to maybe some of the ones that hold up most amount of money at this present time, I think that would be more productive.
Bill, just a quick question on this. So I was looking through the list. It looks like it goes back like till 2011. Is there a statute of limitations? Do we have any people that are older than that, or is this the full list of people that are
You
behind?
can only go back 6 years.
I gotcha.
And 2011 is, some of those could be older, but that's when we changed from one software program to another. So they were lumped into 2011.
Okay. But on this collection, you could only go back 6 years.
Legally, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mark.
Bill, I appreciate it. And this in no way should be something that should be, what's the word I want to use without making it look bad? You know, I think, Michelle, your comment, there was one from 2009. So we're back 12 years now. The whole thing should have been handled by previous administrations. It wasn't. We are going to, and it totals about 69,000. Some of that we aren't going to be able to collect because of the 6-year limit. But if we had been on our toes in years past, that would have happened.
And when you say our, Mark, thank you. You said our, and you mean past administrations and perhaps past select.
Our, I think of our as in Rockport.
Not because nobody.
No. Not us,
was,
but these are the types of things that we're finding that we are having to correct. And it takes up a great deal of our time and Bill's. Bill, I'm appreciative, and Linda, I wish you guys luck, but it's no small amount of money. And once we get ahead of it, then we can keep up with it. And by no means, I mean, I'm more than happy to work out some form of deal with whomever is on the list, but they've got to hold up their end of the bargain. So thank you.
Thanks, Denise.
When we work out deals, is it like a contract where they're legally obligated to pay the amount, or is it just I promise to send a check?
I can't speak as to what's happened in the past, but in my other communities where I've been dealing with delinquent personal property taxes, and this is not unusual, just so the board is aware, because it's a difficult tax to collect by statute, that every town that I've worked in has had an issue with collecting them. What I've done in the past in other communities is that, yes, we put together a written contract that's signed and approved by both parties, the town and the taxpayer, and has penalties and provisions in that if it's not met, then it goes to court or whatever, so that we can then force collection. So I've done those in other communities. I have talked with Bernstein Shore, the town's outside attorneys, and they've got some good information for me in things that have worked in other communities where they've had this issue. And part of it is, we've got to try to put together a plan to try to collect as much of these as we possibly can without costing us more money than we would collect. So, that's an important aspect of it. I think when I do sit down with Linda, and we'll work out a process, if you will, that says, this is the first step, this is the second step, this is the third step, but there'll be other steps in between there, such as the UCC filings, that should be done if there are businesses that are operating as businesses and are filed with the state. If they're sole proprietors, it's a little bit different.
If I might add one little last tidbit, in years past, I was working at the department. Linda and I would work together. Linda would have summonses that would be served by the police chief to the individuals that were in the rears, and that prodded them up. I don't know whether that's still something that can happen, I don't know the paperwork. It's been a while, but I know that I did receive stuff from Linda to go serve to the people that were in the rears. So it can be done, and it can be done fairly easy, I would think, with our existing department. But there shouldn't be a lot of cost associated, I wouldn't think.
We currently are doing that, except for this year because of the pandemic. We did not get to it because of the hours we work, and with all of the elections, we kind of let that slide by. But we have had the police deliver a summons to those businesses that didn't pay, and then they have to pay an extra $50 as a result of that. And that has worked well in the past for some of them. And years ago, there was another local business, and the business owner worked with me. They had difficulties with their bookkeeper. They thought they were paying, they wasn't. They had left their business, and we worked out an agreement which was notarized and approved by legal counsel. And they paid, it was $20,000, and they paid a certain amount of money each month and paid it within a relatively short time. So it can work.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I think that clearly we need to, as you said, Bill, to work out a process. And
Yeah, I think that's, as long as the board is on board with us in developing that process, and then implementing it once we have it in, have it written for the board to review.
okay. Any other comments? Doesn't seem like it. Okay. All right. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Bill. The next item is select board liaison reports. So why don't we start with comprehensive plan, just because I know that Denise has some questions about that, and take it away, Jeff.
Yeah, I attended the renewed comp plan committee meeting that occurred earlier. I think it was this week at 4 o'clock. A portion of the membership was present, but I'd say it was probably 2/3 or so. Recall that there are a total of 18 people on that committee. However, we did have a quorum. It took a considerable amount of time to identify and select a chairperson and a vice chairperson. Some to-dos and action items came out of that meeting that involved collecting some prior documentation and having the members review all that. And then future meetings were identified by the group for proposed times and dates to keep things moving. The time was proposed was at 5 o'clock in the evenings for the first couple meetings anyway. Since I know Denise is concerned about and we all should be, about the loss of 3 people from the 12 citizen group of that committee. I think we need to put into perspective. I'm happy we didn't lose more, and I'll say why. We identified this committee and we worked hard to get everybody together a year ago, and then people were making those commitments to be part of that committee a year ago. A year has since passed, their lives have changed, and as a result, no longer choose to serve on that committee. I'm happy that that only happened to 3 people. I mean, that's what I'm saying. That is where we are. Rich Anderson was selected as the chair. Megan Dwyer was selected as the vice chair. We also have a recording secretary on that committee, and we have, as a committee, a lot of homework to do between now and our next meeting, which is currently scheduled for. I'm going to look at my calendar real quick. February 9th at 5 o'clock.
And Jeff, you and Michelle are both committee members on that group, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Liaisons. And the other thing that I wanted to ask was, or point out, was that Taylor Allen had been a co-chair, and his co-chair had only wanted to serve as co-chair if it was a co-chair, as opposed to having responsibility for the entire chairmanship. So that's why, even though there was a chair, co-chairs, that's why all of a sudden didn't, you were in a position of not having one.
Yeah, and again, a year passed, a lot has changed for a lot of people, and that's how the reasons why things shook out the way they did.
Yeah, and I'm obviously certainly not trying to criticize anyone. I just was concerned, as you mentioned, when I saw 3 resignations, and then when I read Victoria's, it didn't seem to fall into the category of my life's changed, I've gotten too busy. It was just, I don't think I can get to the meetings on time. So I wasn't sure if that had come up, if she had raised that at the meeting, and there just wasn't an appetite to start the meeting a little later.
No, and I think, and I can sympathize with her, because I couldn't go to the first meeting because it was at 4 o'clock. So I think that, you know, what they were trying to do is really get the feedback to determine when is a good meeting time. And so I'm not sure if the 5 o'clock works. I mean, that's still tight for people too that work, you know, in a traditional office schedule. So I'm not sure if a 5 o'clock will meet her needs or not, but I think it's at least, you know, having the conversation to see if that would keep her on the committee.
Yeah.
Or even a 5:30 start if 5 o'clock is too
Okay,
tight
but
for you, Michelle. But what, how do you think the committee feels about that, Jeff? Since you
well, there's certain ways to do this without us trying to stick our fingers as a select board into the committee's doings. What I can do is, as a member, I will help influence the scheduling of those meetings which aren't already scheduled to perhaps shift a half an hour if that makes a difference. But I don't want to be in the position to tell. That's a committee. They get to choose. They get to pick. You know, I am one person amongst 18. So I guess what we need to do, and not for discussion tonight, but we have many a committee that has met at times other than after hours in the town of Rockport that have precluded people from being on those committees as a result. And the list is, I mean, we have meetings right now that are scheduled during normal business hours of committees. So we may want to consider at some point, do we want to establish policy or not regarding that, such that, you know, anybody that's either working or not working full-time can be part of a committee.
Yeah, I think I understand, and I agree with you, Jeff, that, you know, this needs to be a decision of the committee. However, Denise earlier today brought up a good point, and that is that the select board has an interest in this insofar as the select board made the decision to appoint certain people to this group. It's a very important group, and we wanted sort of a cross section of people. And Victoria, you know, fit a particular skill set that we felt was important. So I think it is a select board, we have an interest in making sure that, you know, it's one thing if people say, I don't have time, you know, that's obviously up to them. It's another though, if the committee is not, if the committee can't, you know, if a half an hour adjustment to a start time fulfills the select board's desire to have that person on the group, then I think that's an important thing to convey. And I think it's a fair thing for the select board to have an interest in. And that's a big if. I mean, I don't know if 5:30
Right.
Victoria, you know.
So Denise, perhaps an approach, if you know Victoria, if you can talk to her and find out if a 5:30 or what time might work for her. Ideally, if she could go to the chairperson of that committee and have that conversation, that would be the best approach.
Sure.
And then we can do some sidebar conversations to help encourage participation going forward.
And Jeff, do you think in terms of the numbers, I guess we now have, without Victoria, 3 vacancies from the citizen positions. And yet, as you indicated, it's a pretty large committee as it is. Are we in the where do you come down in terms of, should we be out there looking for more members? Do we have our hands full with?
We have vacancies on the committee. The committee has we established how many people were going to be on the committee. So we have vacancies, and at least 2, correct? So we will need to advertise for additional committee members.
Okay.
Unless we decide as a select board to change the number, and I'm not there.
I don't remember if we, just something for you guys to think about. I don't remember if we set that number because of the number of, more or less the number of
Well, who are applying?
or if we really set it because we thought we really needed 12 or whatever that large number was.
We may have also done it based on historical comp committee membership and makeup as well, and tried to maintain some level of continuity from
Yeah.
version to version.
You might have a discussion. I mean, if there's a thinking that you have enough people, then maybe, the committee should come back and ask the board if we should change the bylaws in terms of the makeup or the number of people. But, I don't know.
As I indicated, I think perhaps 2/3 of the committee were on the call, and I am concerned that any less than that on any given night, and we may not be functional. So I would encourage us to stick to the current plan of having 12 citizen members, and that way, if we have 9 on a call, we still are functional. But if we have 9 and we get down to 6 or 5 or 4, and the rest are other than that group, we're not going to get what we wanted.
And this is, I would say, is probably one of the most important committees, because this is setting the future for Rockport.
This committee right now, made up of great people. It's still in the forming, norming, and storming mode. Okay. As I said, it took a long time to land on some very basics of committee functioning. So it needs to be coddled and nurtured as we proceed here in the next few months, and give them all the love and support they need.
Thank you, Jeff and Michelle.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions on comprehensive plan? Okay, Jeff, since you're there, do you have any other committees to report on?
Yeah, the Harbor Committee met earlier this week. Late last week. The major activities were around ordinance review and some of the provisions in the ordinance. But we don't need to get into the details now because it's all will and discussion, but that's the major activity there. And I'm going to let Mark talk about the Capital Improvement Committee.
Jeff, can I just ask about the Harbor Committee, just because I've had people ask me about all these huge holes along the seawall there.
That's Bill and Mike's.
Okay. Not you guys, never mind.
Purview.
Okay.
Mark, you want to go ahead?
Capital Improvement Committee, we met. They came back with their revised, numerically rated findings. Some were changed, very few, but the majority of them stayed the same. There were some questions like, why are we starting to put money in a reserve for a library roof when it'll probably last 40 years? So they did a pretty thorough vetting of what they were given. And Bill has that, and I suspect he'll be going through the weeds to see what he can manage to put in the budget for this year or not. The one thing that I would bring up is that this would fall under the Parks and Beautification portion of it, and I'll only take a little bit away from Denise because I was on the road for that one. I understood that the lime kiln roof was going to be put in there for $10,000 for, or at least I think that's the number Doug gave me, that was going to be put in the Parks and Beautification's budget for them to fund. I think, And Bill, I think that probably should have been placed in the capital improvement plan, because it did go over the 5,000 threshold. Minor mistake, but I think we can shift it out of that perhaps if you already haven't. And I'll fit.
Well, let me clarify, Mark, on that. We have $4,000 in the budget for the roof. And so the thought was that we can add to that, and we don't think $10,000 is needed for that roof based on previous ones that were done.
Okay.
So
Well, that's fine. I mean, that was just something Doug passed on the other day. And I'm glad he was there to help Hanani do the navigating of that, having Doug been there. The Conservation Committee, again, like the parks, I was on the road for both of those. So that's it for me.
Okay, Michelle, do you have anything?
The only thing, so planning board will meet this week. From the investment committee, the RFP was released last week. I think they're due back on the 12th, and recommendations will be due back to Bill by the 26th. And West Rockport Fire Station has not met, and we already covered comprehensive. So I think that's it for me. Deborah, you're on mute.
Sorry, Denise.
It was a funny thing at the end of the year, Google said the most common phrase all year was, "You're still muted." Let's see. Well, I'll just jump into parks from what Mark reported. An exciting thing the Parks Committee is doing is some of our members have come up with a brochure that they sort of mocked up for us, where we talk about each of the different parks, and that brochure the Parks Committee would put together, and it'd be available down at Harbor Park, where various tourists might come and could explore all the other parks in our system. Some discussion also of the library landscaping. We're talking about a tree program. The Parks Committee is going to do a tree survey and see where we have need for trees. Our memorial bench program is off to a good start. We've sold 2 benches and have a third one in the discussion now. So that's been very successful. We have one of the benches is now installed over at Walker Park. And then we have one on display by the library with a little sign inviting people to call us about those memorial benches. Opera House, the Opera House Committee is working on sort of in tandem with the town's new website, the Opera House link, and developing some new material. And Nancy Albertson, our new members, working closely with a small group to set up the content for that website. Legacy Rockport met this afternoon at 4, and Jeff Parker had prepared a video that was in the works for the bicentennial, the big dinner that we were going to have back in March, which all got canceled because of the pandemic. But Jeff has now edited all the footage and information he had, and it's a pretty inspiring video. There's some wonderful footage of early Rockport days and interviews with longtime Rockport residents, and it goes out to Simonton Corners, to the meeting hall there, and Rockville Chapel, and it's a really wonderfully warm look at what makes Rockport a wonderful, unique place. ZBA met last Thursday and denied the appeal of the hotel. This was sort of a long time coming, but finally last Thursday night adopted the findings of fact and conclusions of law and made their final decision. And that's it.
Thanks, Denise. The Economic Development Committee and the RES Task Force and the ORC are all working together, and we're trying to coordinate that work on some draft ordinances. Recall that one of the things that this board had identified as a priority for the ORC was to take a look at some things like housing density and so forth for the RES, for example, for the RES site, but housing density to to encourage or make it possible for some growth or economic development areas within Rockport. And so the Economic Development Committee is working on that. The RES task force is coordinating with the Economic Development Committee in that regard. And they're going to give feedback to the Ordinance Review Committee, who is going to look at RES, potential RES density changes, maybe height changes in the event that we, are looking at a developer putting in some condos or townhouses or other workforce attainable kind of housing there. All that, of course, would come back to the board. The idea is to try to have something back to the board for the RES site, at least for the June ballot, so that the earlier we can make some of those changes, the earlier we can try to attract some kind of development at the RES site, because those are all precursors to attracting a developer. So anyway, there's a lot going on between those three entities to try to make that happen. And of course, the ORC, that's Denise's bailiwick, but the ORC is looking at, is going to look at density and other things in other areas of Rockport, not just RES, but we were trying to prioritize RES. And the Economic Development Committee is working to make recommendations in a broader perspective to the ORC. Having said that, let's see, and then the broadband, I briefly reported last time after having returned to the meeting that I missed about the broadband task force. We now officially have renamed it the Midcoast Broadband Task Force, and we have Lincolnville and Hope, who voted to who agreed to join the task force. And so we have a task force meeting on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, which is the first meeting with those 4 towns. We're asking Bill Napower and others to actively look at grants for the potential for a regional broadband approach, and a whole host of other items to try to hopefully put some reality to that project. So any questions for anybody else?
I wanted to raise one. I forgot about the library committee. I mean, I didn't really forget about them. I should have a list. Anyway, the library committee met. Things are going gangbusters over at the library. We're getting 2 to 5 new library record requests a day, and many of those are out of Rockport, so we're even generating revenue. And it's just been a nice steady influx of people, never too many where people are having to wait outside, but always people coming in. The library's now open Saturdays, and that's a big deal. I spoke with Bill about getting the library signage for the parking, that it's dedicated to the library, and I think that's in the works. So it's, people are coming from far and wide to come see our library.
Great. Anything else? Bill, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is that I have saved the comments on the live stream on the short-term rental topic, and I'll just provide those to the board in an email so that we don't lose sight of those, because there was questions about that in the live stream. A lot of the questions were discussed by members. I think by Michelle and Mark brought up a lot of them anyway, and I tried to answer some of them in the live stream. But again, encourage people to tune into the February 16th workshop, and I'll attempt to answer questions there that I can. Otherwise, I'll take their comments down and provide those on too.
Great. And as you said, the February 16th workshop is dedicated to just short-term rental public comment.
Correct.
Okay, if that's it, I think we could entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, Michelle,
Yes.
Jeff,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Linda.
Yep, thanks, everyone.